Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Insidious The Red Door, starring Ty Simpkins, Patrick Wilson, Sinclair Daniel, and Rose Byrne, directed by Patrick Wilson. Now, before I get into this movie, welcome back to Insidious after all those years. And I remember how much the first one was okay, but the rest of them were not the best. We'll see if this is an improvement, but we'll see how this goes. Let's get into this movie. I went twice, and I laughed, and yeah, you'll get the point. Let's get into it. We open when we last saw Josh Lambert, returned by Patrick Wilson, and Dalton as a kid, returned by Ty Simpkins from the first movie. No, not first movie, second movie, ready to forget about the further once and for all. Thanks to this movie, good luck with all that as we move on to 9 years later. Josh's mother passes away, and Josh and Dalton are at her funeral with Renee, returned by Rose Byrne, barely, who feels wasted in this movie, as well as Foster and Kaylee. And Dalton comes off like a pretentious ass. In this movie, since it's been a few years since Josh and Renee's divorce. Yes, I got that from the trailer. They're divorced. We see Carl from the second movie coming to Josh's mother's funeral as he said Josh's name without knowing how he knew him in the first place, which was bothering me from the get-go. Meanwhile, Josh texts Dalton about taking him to school after Renee suggested it to begin with. Well, someone is behind him, as it could be frightening for the kids, as this is a PG-13 rated horror movie, which is the thing I hate the most. But I laughed at that point in the movie. And we begin with the opening credits as we see Dalton drawing some things from the past. And I'm going to confess that I got scared a couple of times in this movie. And I'll get there when I get there. But most of the time, I laughed at this movie when it was trying to be scary, as it's too silly to be a horror film. Josh takes Dalton to school, and as they arrive there, we get to Dalton's dorm room. And who's his roommate? A female named Chris Winslow, played by Sinclair Daniel. And how did this school screw up the dorm room situation? Which doesn't make sense. So she talks to the dorm room people and to get it worked out, while Dalton and Josh have an argument, as he says, no wonder mom divorced you as well, and telling him to get help. And is this the character I want to be around with? No, because he acts like an ass to his father. I don't like Dalton for that reason alone. And I can't believe this is the character we're following in this whole frickin' film. Dalton talks with Chris about some weird things from his past, and he says he can't remember when he was 10 years old, which was an awkward scene, and the actors performing in this scene were just not into it. In my opinion, Chris is the best character in this movie, as she is more on the comedic side of things, and I'll give the movie a point for that. Dalton goes to his first day in class with Professor Armagon. I don't know if I'm saying the name right. Please forgive me. Who comes off harsh by telling a student to tear his art project and tells him to leave the classroom, and Dalton tears his off. And she says to forget his past, as well as everybody in the classroom's past, while they draw something completely different, as Dalton draws a door and a hand grabs him out of the blue. And that did scare me. I'll give the movie a point for that, as that's a good thing for a horror film. And I think this scene for the scary moment, and I like this scene for the scary moment for making me jump in my seat. Josh goes to the doctor to see what's wrong with him, and while he's there, the lights go out, and he tries to get out of the testing booth and sees something is in there with him, and it's a ghost. And I was rooting for the lipstick demon, aka the frickin' Darth Maul lookalike, to show up, as the doctor says to him he's been asleep for 15 minutes. And the doctor also asks him if he has any mental illness. He sounds like a terrible doctor, as Josh says he might have been dreaming about any demons too as of lately. And we move back to Dalton as he draws. The lights go out, and I was waiting for the lipstick demon to show up by saying in my head, please let it be Darth Maul. While he sees a bloody handprint, and Chris shows up and says she's in the floor above him, and she sees a crumpled up paper to go to a party at a frat house, and Dalton doesn't want to go to this party, and Chris talks him into it, and what a lame way to go to a lame party like that. While the party, we meet Nick the Dick, who comes off like a douchebag, while Chris and Dalton go into his room, and Chris does some things like steal some shit, while Dalton sees someone vomiting in the toilet, as it's in his imagination, while Nick the Dick comes in and practices talking to someone named Paige, whom he's in love with, is what I'm getting the impression from. And Nick the Dick leaves the room, and Dalton tries to get out of underneath the bed and sees the same guy in his imagination vomiting in his face, and Chris comes in and kisses him as Nick the Dick comes in and insults her, and she is saying to him, we're gonna do it. And that's something you don't say if you're pretending to have sexual intercourse, but not end up doing it anyways. That doesn't make any sense. Like, you never do that. And Nick the Dick gets kicked in the dick, which is amusing to me, but the party scene was just lame. While Josh getting help, I didn't care for much for that either. Dalton goes into Chris's room, which is creepy while he's asleep, and seeing things like the dead frat that vomited on Dalton in the last scene. And Chris goes to Dalton's dorm and sleeps with him for the night after he tells her something strange things are happening, which could creep me out to begin with. Josh is at his own house and sees Dalton went to the party and says it was lame, and I thought it was, and we see the ghost creeping at Josh's house while it pretends to break the glass, or actually attacks him for that matter, which is the second thing that made me jump. So I'll give the movie another point for making me jump in my seat then too. Dalton is in class, and at night he calls Foster and says a red door that he painted, and Foster says he doesn't want to go to college, and Chris enters and shows Dalton a couple of videos, and one is of Specs and Tucker returning briefly by Lee Winnell and Angus Simpson explaining what he feels, and shows Elise Rayner return also briefly by Lynn Shay going into the further, and they go back to the frat house where Nick the Dick lives at, and stays in another frat room where Dalton goes into the further to see the vomiting ghost, and he goes into Nick the Dick's room while in the further, and he finally sees Lipstick Demon while Josh is at the library looking up his past, and goes to Renee's house to talk about what happened in the past while Dalton sees how Chris is feeling and tells him not to mess with that anymore. And again, good luck with that, as that is not going to happen until this movie is over. Dalton calls Foster about his past and starts to remember what happened back in Insidious Chapter 2. Meanwhile, Renee is talking with him about what happened to him and Dalton in the past, and Foster comes in asking Josh if that's him, and his memory comes back, as does Dalton, when he dreams about what happened back in the second movie, when Josh went ballistic and Dalton goes into the further to stop Josh from killing Dalton as a kid, as it was a demon from the second movie, in which I forgot the name because I don't care. And that's how forgettable the second movie is, in my opinion. And I also can't believe we're going back to this story. Chris comes into Dalton's dorm, and he's acting like a demon and is scaring the hell out of Chris. And that's when we get the PG-13 reading one use of the F word, as it was so late in the movie. While Josh looks for Dalton in the further, excuse me, is a demon. And do I care about any of this? No. Josh lets Dalton out of the chains to get away from the lipstick demon and goes to the red door, as Josh blocks the door from the lipstick demon and lets Dalton get away, and he disappears from the further, and Josh almost dies until Dalton paints the red door, and Lipstick Demon almost gets out, but Dalton completely blocks him out, and it'll never return again, maybe. And Josh gets out remembering his father, whom he's never met and is angry at, but he luckily gets out of, and the next day comes, and Renee invites him to the house for dinner, as he sees Elise, and he doesn't remember her, and she says his name, and how does she know his name as he never gives it, which was once again bugging me. And Josh and Dalton hug it out, and we roll credits to a terrible song that Patrick Wilson sang with the band called Ghost. Now remember, he was in Joel Schumacher's version of The Phantom of the Opera, but it's a really bad song, and after the credits is a flickering light to a door where Lipstick Demon might get out, and the climax wasn't that suspenseful, as I mostly laughed at the end of the day. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 4.3 out of 10. I'll give the movie a couple of points for scaring me a couple of times, and Chris was the best character in this whole movie, as Dalton was a terrible character to begin with, and I don't like being back with the Lamberts this time, and like in the second movie, as most of the time I laughed at the scenes in this movie as it was way too silly to be a horror movie. The dialogue was terrible, as the movie is absolutely laughable, and that is mostly not a good thing for a horror movie. And I was really disappointed that we don't get enough Lipstick Demon, as I was rooting the entire time for him to show up when he didn't. I hope there's no more from the Lamberts and the Insidious franchise, as they keep making these movies from more and more unlikable. Just leave it as is, with that terrible song Patrick Wilson sang for that band, other than during the credits. So it's a non-recommendation. What do you want me to tell you? So I would like to thank you guys for joining me and coming back with Insidious. And until then, he's got your baby. He's got your baby.